Alright, so this time we're running the overhead landing profile. Starts at the same spot as the straight in landing, but this time instead of just basically gliding it right down to the runway, we are going to do the overhead pattern. And the overhead pattern is, it's not really a difficult pattern per se, but it does just take some practice. And I actually enjoy doing this. I think it's fun to try to run the overhead pattern a few times in a row and really try to get good at it. Basically, we're going to fly right over the runway, straight down the runway. So the first thing we want to do is get lined up with the runway, bring our altitude down to about 1,500 feet, and have our airspeed be about 300 knots. We'll go ahead and call the tower and request an overhead landing, overhead approach.
Goblin 2-1, S-16, 10 miles, south, 1,000, inbound for overhead landing.
Goblin 2-1, contact tower for landing.
Okay, so we'll go ahead.
Goblin 2-1, Gunasan approach. You are cleared all the way in for overhead approach. Runway 3.
So we go in ahead and switch to tower frequency because the next thing we're going to need to do, we basically fly 1,500 feet, 300 knots, right over the runway. Just right down the runway. And then at the end of the runway, we're going to brake to the left over the water. And when we do, we need to contact the tower and call our brake. That, for game purposes at the very least, is very important because if you don't call your brake, you won't get landing clearance. If you do call your brake, you'll get landing clearance automatically once you come back around and line up with the runway. So we're going to fly down the runway, and then once we reach the end, we'll brake left over the water. We basically do a big oval racetrack shape. Come back on a reciprocal heading along the runway, and then we sort of do a descending turn into the runway. It's a nice, quick, easy way to land as long as you can see. This is a very visual landing, and that's why it just takes a lot of time. Landing straight in is sort of technical, and you can sort of go by the numbers or fly the AOA bracket, and it's pretty easy. Overhead landing, it just takes a little bit of practice to recognize the visual cues and to know how to line your plane up correctly. So here we're going to make our overhead brake. So we'll report overhead brake.
One, brake left.
Bank, brake. And this is one of those, how much do you bank, how much do you turn? Again, it comes down to feel. We're trying to do a level turn at 1,500 knots, or sorry, at 1,500 feet. And as we turn, we're bleeding off airspeed. We're trying to come to a reciprocal heading, which for this landing strip or runway is 176. And as we roll out on 176, we want to be roughly 230 to 250 knots. At that point, we can drop our landing gear. You can see we're now flying basically back down the runway, and we're going the opposite direction that we were. And now from here, you're basically just looking where you're at and trying to line your plane up in 3 dimensions with the runway. So here in just a second, we're going to start a descending turn into the runway. And we have to do several things at one time. We have to manage our speed. We have to manage our altitude. We're trying to bring our altitude down to meet the 3-degree glide slope. At the same time, we're trying to bring our heading back around to 356 to line up with the runway. And we're trying to do all of that at one time.
Wayne 320 at 6 knots, runway 36, clear for landing, jet gear down.
And it's just very visual. So as you come around and you start to get lined up with the runway, that's where you can really refine where you're at. So there, my initial turn was probably a little too sharp. And I also came out a little high. Now we're a little low. So we overcorrected a little bit, but I'm still trying to bring my speed down. I basically have my throttle cut at this point. And I'm trying to bring my speed down to get my AOA bracket up where I want it, right there. Fly the flight path marker right to the ground. Check the gear down. It is. Okay. And then now that we're over the runway threshold, we flare it a little bit, and we let the plane settle right into the runway. We're still a little fast, and that's kind of why the plane, as we flared it, sort of drifted back up. And now rudder to keep the plane in the middle, holding that 12-degree angle with the gun cross until the plane drops on its own. So for not having played in a while, that was not a bad overhead landing. As we came out of that final turn, we were a little high, and we turned a little too sharp getting into there. But having done these overhead landings quite a few times, I'd rather turn too sharp initially and be able to shallow out my turn than not turn enough and have to crank a really hard turn to get lined up with the runway. It's easier to shallow out your turn than it is to make a real sharp turn.
2-1, contact ground, switch to 273-525.
So we're going to give the runway, the overhead pattern, another crack. This is, as I said before, it's something you just have to do and practice to really get it down. I never practice these enough to really get them down, and I end up going off into the campaigns and playing, but then I practice them as I'm playing the campaign, of course. One thing I forgot in the last one is as you make your turn, at the very least, into the descending turn into the runway, you want to put your speed brakes out. The speed brakes help because, especially in older model F-16s, apparently, according to the manual, the speed brakes can retract faster than the engine can spool. So if you need to increase your airspeed, maybe you need to abort the landing or something like that, you can pull your speed brakes back in while also advancing your throttle, and that will help you gain some of that initial velocity before your throttle or your engine spools up and really starts to push you. So this time around, we'll try to do that. I also will probably talk a little bit less as I'm sort of trying to fly the pattern, and just focus on trying to line everything up correctly. Getting set up correctly is a good start, so I'm right at 1,500 feet, 300 knots. Let's go ahead and call the tower.
Goblin 2-1, F-16, 5 miles, south, 1,000, inbound for overhead landing. Goblin 2-1, finish sound approach. You're cleared all the way in for overhead approach, runway 36. QH2984. Goblin 2-1, contact tower for landing. Switch to 29230.
So I switched to the tower frequency, so I'm ready for that, ready to report overhead brake. I like to go ahead and pull that up, so all I have to do is hit the number. It will take me a little while to get used to the fact that it's that asking for an overhead approach is number 5 now instead of number 3 like it's been for a long time. And to help speed this up to get on the ground quicker, you can make your brake earlier. So as soon as the opposite end of the runway disappears under the nose of the plane, you can go ahead and start making that brake. So that was a pretty good turn in there. We are flying with the runway right off our wingtip, which for me, I don't know, that's just where I prefer it. The manual says it should be kind of right under your wingtip, but I prefer it to be a little off. And then we are ready for our turn in. So I'm going to open on my speed brakes as I make this turn, and I'm also going to try to pay attention to my speed, make sure it doesn't get too low.
Goblin 2, Kunsan Tower, wing 320 at 6 knots, runway 36, cleared for landing, check gear down.
So that time we turned not quick enough, really. It was close, but we were just a little slow on our turn, so we overshot the runway by a little bit. Not much though, so not too bad. Get lined up, flight path marker, bring our speed down so we can get our AOA bracket in the right place. We're slowly pulling that AOA bracket up as our flight path marker drops, and then we can bring our throttle back in. Cross the runway threshold, pull that throttle back a little bit, pull the nose up a little bit of flare. Too much flare. Wheels down. And my rudder pedals are backwards, so I'm off the wrong side of the runway. So even that, just one more time practicing that overhead brake pattern was a bit better. We came out at roughly the correct altitude, almost lined up with the runway, not quite, we were a little off, but it was pretty close. We didn't have to make too many major adjustments, so that's good.